Good afternoon. Today we would like to discuss the Everest 1996 case analysis. Group 2 members include Brooke Anderson, Bill Gombert, A.J. Kulkarni, Allison Shore, and Keith Tanner. We will be discussing Tuckman's theory of stages of group formation, entitativity, collective efficacy, conflict, decision-making, conformity, deviance, creativity, groupthink and hidden profiles, and the dynamics within Group 2. In the first section, we will analyze Tuckman's theory of stages of group formation in regard to Mount Everest 1996. The first stage of the theory is the forming stage. This stage is typically marked by high anxiety, uncertainty, and politeness. Several climbers were confident about their own capabilities, but worried about whether they could rely on others during difficult times. They fretted of not being accepted by others and felt it was difficult to develop relationships. This is typical in early stages, but no small concern when actions by a single member can affect the welfare of the entire team, especially since this group had multiple individual competing motives: publicity, personal challenge, career enhancement, and mountain experience. The second and third stages, namely storming and norming, are typically marked by conflict, power struggles, definition of roles, and later by structure and trust. However, in the case of Everest 1996, as this was a conjunctive task, the phases were left to the individuals to develop. There wasn't much of storming and norming, as the leader had set strong ground rules early that this was the absolute law. He would be calling all the shots, and there was no latitude for individual decision-making. On account of this directive leadership, the leader was providing only technical expertise and failed to create an environment in which members can adapt as a team. They remained as individuals thrown together by a common goal, but they never got the time to cohere into a team. They were at best task functional and largely relationally dysfunctional, which in our opinion drastically impacted the fourth phase and most important phase, the performing phase. The group seemed to have moved quickly from early anxiety and uncertainty, skipping storming and norming, to be directly thrown into a harrowing situation where they needed to perform during the push to the summit. They never got to a point where they were comfortable with each other or felt the need to communicate and share different types of knowledge and expertise. Barring a few instances where individuals came to rescue others, calling this group of people a team is just a label. Their contract was solely with Hall and Fisher. Even though the collective efficacy of the group was minimal, we are of the opinion Hall's and Fisher's self-efficacy in terms of strong leadership and timely decision-making could have still averted this catastrophe. Since at no point did the informal group make any investment in cohesiveness, the members shared no sense of identity with each other. In short, in terms of Campbell's entitativity, this group was a loose association. However, we feel sufficient time should have been spent to get to higher levels of entitativity to a level of task group, which would have significantly improved conformity, cohesiveness, and interdependency. The next section we will look at is collective efficacy. Collective efficacy is defined as group members' shared belief that they can execute a specific task successfully. In our opinion, each group did achieve collective efficacy at some point. The bigger question is whether or not it was within the appropriate amount of time. We believe that both groups achieved the collective efficacy almost immediately, essentially which means day one of beginning their journey. There are several factors that contributed to this sense of collective efficacy so soon. Those factors are: both groups were led by two of the world's most experienced high-altitude climbers. Each leader came with a vast amount of prior experience, which contributed to the attractiveness of embarking on this journey with them. It seemed as though they couldn't be in better hands. Another factor was that each group had members whom all shared a common goal. If we look at the definition of collective efficacy that says, shared belief that they can execute a specific task successfully, each member of the groups truly believed this. Our overall conclusion is that both groups achieved the sense of collective efficacy far too soon in the process. As we see throughout the case, doubts and concerns seem to arise with many of the members as performance is shown. For example, Bookgreave had many reservations about the level of readiness of the Mountain Madness group shortly after arriving at base camp. Additionally, Crocker also had concerns about the Adventure Consultants group, but brushed those off and continued with the journey. Had the groups not achieved collective efficacy so soon, there might be cause to say that maybe they never would have. As the performance started to be shown, many doubts grew and many climbers seemed to be doubtful that the entire group was going to execute the task successfully. Nevertheless, even though many clients had doubts about one another, they remained confident in their own abilities to complete the climb. We are now going to move on to the topic of conflict. When we think of the term conflict, we may think of it as the traditional sense to relate to confrontation of disagreement or disagreements. In this case, we are referring to both functional and dysfunctional forms of conflict. The fact that both groups possessed a strong sense of collective efficacy impacted their handling of conflict in the sense that none of it was really addressed at any point, and if it was, it wasn't followed through on. For example, many individuals had concerns around the ability of some of the other climbers or even concerns around their own abilities, but when they tried to address it, it seemed as though the sense of collective efficacy overcame their concern for the conflict. Let's take a look at some of the forms of conflict that seem to be present. Process conflict. This type of conflict refers to how to address the problem or concern and is a functional type of conflict. It seemed as though many individuals knew what the concerns or challenges were, so knew what to address, but weren't sure exactly on how to address the issues. For example, the case references that several individuals had concerns on Buchreev's decision not to climb with oxygen as it could impact his physical and mental ability to guide them. This was recognized as a form of conflict, so the what to address was identified. But given his background and experience, it seemed many didn't know exactly how to address this issue with him. Another example is that of the 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. advised turnaround time. It was discussed that if individuals had not reached the summit by this time, they would need to turn around to ensure safety. Unfortunately, a specific time was never determined, and this process was not followed, contributing to the unfortunate ending. Many of the individuals knew that this should be the process to follow, but when their guides were not enforcing a turnaround, it was not addressed by the other climbers. Again, it seems that the how do we address this was a challenge, and therefore the conflict was overlooked. Another form of conflict that is present is that of relational conflict. This type of conflict is dysfunctional and refers to who in the group will address. This type of conflict is easy to spot in this scenario, as it seems you can look at the examples above and infer that no one in the group chose to address the conflict. Given the background of the experienced guides and the sense of collective efficacy, much of the conflict was ignored and not addressed. We will now look at the decision-making that took place in this case. Obviously, this situation resulted in terrible tragedy for many and ultimately resulted in the loss of several lives. As is quoted in the Reflecting Back section, the events of May 10th were not an accident nor an act of God. They were the end result of people who were making decisions about how and whether to proceed. We can infer from the end results and the statement above that these decisions resulted in negative decision framing. Loss frame decision-making results when groups are faced with important decisions and they frame those decisions as choices between losses. Essentially, through group discussions and conversations, the preference for risk becomes more heightened than it might be individually. We believe that it's safe to say that both groups adopted a loss frame decision-making mindset in their journeys. Unfortunately, for many of the individuals, the reward outweighed the risk, and they chose to make the wrong decision in many situations. First, many individuals were having physical challenges prior to starting the final summit, but they chose to continue anyway as they wanted to reap the reward of making it to the top. Additionally, it seems that both guides chose to ignore many factors that should have been considered. For example, not deciding a firm turnaround time for the groups and then not following the suggested turnaround time. Additionally, both guides recognized the physical impairments of a few of their group members, but needed to have a successful climb for their own benefit, that they chose to encourage the members to continue anyway, even knowing it was probably too risky. It would seem that there could have been a better approach made when making decisions. As the decision makers and leaders, both Hall and Fisher should have been more aware of the role that both collective efficacy and self-efficacy was playing in influencing the group and the decisions. The decisions could have been framed differently and reflected potentially only the risk and repercussions that would ensue versus the reward being involved. As leaders, they both should have learned the way to frame the decisions based on safety versus only seeing the losses and gains that would result. Next, we will discuss conformity. There are two types of conformity. Informational influence, which is when people conform in order to be correct, assuming that when others agree, they are more likely to be correct. The other type of conformity is normative influence, which is when people fear consequences of appearing deviant, so they alter behavior. In this case, we believe that it is very apparent that normative influence is a factor. Some examples of how normative influence played out in the Mount Everest case are when a guide for the Mountain Madness team, Bukreev, encountered the IMAX team. He began to worry about the weather conditions likely to prevail during his group summit bid. He mentioned that he was not happy with the conditions on the mountain. After more than 2 decades of climbing, he had developed certain intuitions, and his feeling was that things were not right. He mentioned that for several days the weather had not been stable, and high winds had been blowing at higher elevations. He wanted his feelings to be heard, but he said it was very clear that Scott Fisher did not look upon his advice in the same way he did Rob Hall's. He stated that his voice was not as authoritative as he would like, so instead of speaking up, he tried not to be argumentative, choosing instead to downplay his intuitions. Another example is when the Sherpa from Team Mountain Madness sensed that one of the clients, Pittman, was struggling shortly after departing from Camp 5. He towed her on a short rope for nearly 6 hours. A day earlier, he had carried Pittman's satellite phone for hours to lessen the burden for the weakened client. These efforts left him exhausted and ill on summit day, causing him to fall well behind the lead climbers. Pittman had recognized that the Sherpa's extraordinary level of assistance might place an overwhelming burden on him, but she did not object to his decision, stating that she didn't unclip herself from the Sherpa out of respect for his authority. The next example is of numerous climbers who noticed Fisher's deteriorating physical condition during the ascent, yet no one questioned his plans to proceed. Later, as several climbers descended to Camp 5, they encountered Fisher still trying to ascend with great difficulty. Even with his condition very apparent, nobody discussed his exhausted appearance or advised him to turn around. The final example of normative influence is when guide Andy Harris became extremely disoriented during the descent and made a critical error. He mistakenly came to the conclusion that there was no supplemental oxygen at the south summit. Crowker and Adams discovered this error when they arrived at the south summit, but they could not convince Harris that he was mistaken, so they continued without him. Later, Crowker regretted that he did not raise concerns about Harris's physical condition or question his ability to descend safely. He stated that his ability to discern the obvious was exacerbated to some degree by the guide-client protocol. He also mentioned that it was inconceivable to him that he would have neglected to recognize this dangerous situation. Destructive deviance is very apparent in this case. Guide Bukreev descended the mountain quickly, which was against group norms, and left his clients, which was against hypernorms. Destructive conformity is also apparent. The individuals deviate from hypernorms of safety and security and were conforming to reference groups norms by not speaking up. The structure and management of both the adventure consultants and Mountain Madness suppressed creativity within their clients. It seems as though this was not done intentionally, but was initially done to maintain control of the group to ensure their safety. Creative thinking refers to how people approach problems and solutions and the thought process that goes with that. Because there was a norm established from the very beginning of the climb that what the leaders say goes, group members did not feel as though they were allowed to voice their ideas. Another way the leaders can suppress creativity is by changing the goals, or more importantly, failing to clearly define those goals. This was shown by Hall and Fisher stressing the importance of turning around individuals and not reach the summit by a certain time, but never actually deciding on a time, sticking with it, and communicating that to the rest of the group. This resulted in some group members not reaching the summit until 4:15 p.m. Group members may have freedom around process, but if they don't know where they are headed, such freedom is pointless. Some ways to improve creativity within the group could be to encourage group members to speak up if they have an idea. It is understandable why the leaders would not want clients questioning certain decisions, but there also needs to be an open line of communication or some sort of way for clients to have their thoughts and opinions heard. Another way is to set clearly defined goals and ensure all members within the group are aware of those goals. Sometimes the goals may have to be modified, and if that is the case, the leaders need to be sure to communicate that throughout the group. Having the leaders create mutually supportive groups with a diversity of perspectives is also extremely important in fostering creativity. It seems as though these teams had very diverse groups. However, in order for this to work, group members must also share excitement over team goals and display a willingness to help their teammates through difficult periods and setbacks, as well as recognize the unique knowledge and perspective other members within the group bring to the table, which doesn't seem to be the case for both of these teams. Next is groupthink and hidden profiles. Symptoms of groupthink and hidden profiles certainly are a part of the groups of climbers. Groupthink symptoms such as invulnerability, censorship, and fear of separation showed up in several areas of the study. First is invulnerability. Every member had an attitude of, "We're all going to make it." Hall's comments such as, "It's worked 39 times so far, and some of the people who summited with me were nearly as pathetic as you," and "I can get any reasonably fit person to the summit," increased this thought process. Next is censorship and collective rationalization. Bookreeve downplayed his intuitions about weather conditions in order to remain part of the community. No one challenged Fisher as his condition deteriorated either. The group rationalized that there was no reason to doubt that they wouldn't make it. Silence was taken as agreement, and no one made any challenges. Information from the guide was a hidden profile that was not shared and very well could have saved lives. This showed up in several times: weather concerns, lack of radios, and age and condition of radios that were used. There were multiple qualities of the group that contributed to groupthink and hidden profiles. The group consisted largely of paying customers, wealthy people who didn't have much in common. The groupthink that resulted was one of, "I paid for it, so I'm going to do it," treating it as a particularly expensive tourist attraction and not a risky endeavor. The status of some of the senior guides made the adventures comfortable and the Sherpas and junior guides timid of challenging their authority and reputation. The qualities of the situation that had contributed to groupthink or hidden profiles effects are as follows. Calm conditions up front and a few years of good weather led to a lull in vigilance from the senior guides, and tourists were treated as tourists and not mountaineers. The qualities of Fisher and Hall as leaders could have contributed to groupthink or hidden profiles effects. They themselves believed they were invulnerable due to their high success rate. They believed they did not need input from others, even those with relative experience. These effects could have been avoided by ensuring that the route, deadlines, and other decisions are done by all guides instead of just Hall and Fisher. A clear chain of command should have been created in the event that one of the main guides was unable to continue to lead. These decisions should have been communicated to the entire team, allowing them to ask questions and understand why the decisions were being made. Most adventurers knew little about climbing, but stressing the importance of a turnaround time and communicating it was a mutual decision by a group of people with the right experience might have prevented some of the issues. The leaders should have been very clear about the dangers of the mountain. A strong effort should have been made to educate the climbers and make sure they understood how many lives the mountain has taken and reinforce their decisional authority as experts. It is difficult to say for sure if these types of interventions would have been effective in this situation, but we think it would have helped. Leadership is a key element in ensuring that groupthink and hidden profile effects are understood and negated. Strong leaders who understand these dynamics can have powerfully positive impacts as they shatter groupthink and encourage participation that eliminates or reduces hidden profiles. Next are the team dynamics within Group 2. First is group stages and entitativity. Our group formed last year in our first semester as a formal group. We were assigned a group project for an online course and randomly joined the same group. At the onset, we went through the forming stage and tried to develop some specific norms for that project. Since we established our group norms very early on, we didn't experience much storming. Everyone knew their roles, completed their tasks on time, and there hasn't been any infighting. In essence, we quickly got to the norming stage with everyone being open and honest about their strengths and weaknesses, and we soon understood expectations of behavior. During the performing stages, our meetings became less and less formal, and we quickly transitioned to an informal group as friendships were formed. We've worked on every group project together since and are still able to operate within the framework established on the first project. Unlike the Everest teams, we have a high degree of trust in one another and have achieved what we feel is a high level of entitativity. This is further evidenced by our decreasing permeability, high ability to act, cohesiveness in the sense that we always choose to work with each other. Next is collective efficacy in dealing with conflict. As mentioned above, the cohesiveness of the group is very high, and we feel that provides us with an equally high degree of self-efficacy. The aforementioned understanding of each member's strengths and weaknesses allow us to appropriately manage workloads and complete tasks confidently. According to Glenn White's paper on the key role of collective efficacy, perceptions of collective efficacy should be positively related to group performance. Results of this can be seen in the timely completion and grades received on each of our projects, none of which have received less than a grade of A. Our level of collective efficacy helps us also navigate conflict in a more constructive way. There really isn't any relational conflict, so most conflicts are related to tasks and processes and are therefore functional in nature. The most common type of conflict our group deals with is process conflict, which focuses on strategic and logistical issues such as scheduling deadlines and the division of labor. Being that we all work full-time, much of which requires travel, and most of us have children, scheduling and the logistics around activities where we can meet together can be difficult at times. Due to the time constraints, sometimes these process conflicts don't emerge until there is a time crunch, which can make the conflict more difficult to manage than it has to be. According to John and Mannix, important conflicts at the beginning of a project related to administrative decisions about task assignments and deadlines should be resolved early in order for groups to have sufficient time to discuss task-related issues necessary to produce high-quality work. Our group could do a better job to improve in this area. Next is conformity and creativity. Although our collective efficacy is high, we are seemingly still able to avoid too much conformity. Everyone has a voice, and no one is afraid to share their opinion for the sake of the group dynamics. However, there are times where the previously discussed time constraints may force some group members into accepting a plan or result they may not agree with. We're not willing to concede this as normative influence specifically, as group members aren't conforming because they fear the consequences of being deviant. Rather, all group members recognize their personal time constraints, those of the other group members, and the deadlines within which work must be completed. Likely, as is the case with our process conflict discussed above, better time management would help us to improve here. Given the work we perform in our groups is related to school projects, there aren't many hypernorms that factor directly into any of our decision making. Group members tend to operate under standard cultural norms of safety and human survival, and there isn't deviation from these norms. That being said, there isn't any destructive conformity or destructive deviance occurring. There were instances of constructive deviance where group members deviated from group norms in order to improve portions of the project. For example, additional reading was performed on deviance and changes were made on the fly by one group member to ensure the section read correctly. This was later communicated back to the group, at which point all members agreed on the revised wording and ultimately became constructive conformity, but started as deviation from the group. Along those same lines, the group welcomes creativity and innovation in the work that we're doing if it benefits the project and ultimately the team. Our structure is such that there is no clear leader and we operate more on consensus. While this does foster creativity within the group, it's also led to some difficulties getting started on the project. One particular night when we didn't have time to meet, there was a brainstorming group tech session as to how the PowerPoint should flow. Although many constructive ideas were shared, it took much longer to start pressing forward than if there was a clearly established leader providing direction and keeping everyone on task. Next is groupthink and hidden profiles. Although our group is willing to share ideas and not shy away from functional conflict, we do think we experienced some groupthink on this project, as evidenced by the symptom of overestimation, which was likely caused by the deadlines mentioned above and their effects on everyone's personal and professional lives. This resulted in less discussion than we would typically like to commit and reaching consensus more quickly. For example, when discussing some of the actions of the Everest group and where they fell in the conformity and deviance matrix, the group had several opinions regarding one specific situation where both descending quickly, leaving the climbers he was supposed to be guiding behind. We had a difficult time deciding whether his actions for his personal safety would be operating within hypernorms or if the fact he left his team on the mountain would be the opposite. There is some subjectivity here, and we ultimately decided on what we discussed previously in order to continue moving forward. As we mentioned above, everyone has become aware of the other's strengths and weaknesses throughout the various stages of the group. As such, we don't feel there were any hidden profiles that could have additionally benefited the group. As evidenced by the analysis above, it's clear that our team can benefit from improved time management and creating more clearly defined roles as opposed to just group norms. Doing this would help foster even deeper discussions, reduce process conflict and groupthink, and improve project efficiency, and alleviate some of the stresses we may have unnecessarily placed on ourselves. In summary, we discussed Tuckman's theory of stages of group formation, entitativity, collective efficacy, conflict, decision-making, conformity, deviance, creativity, groupthink and hidden profiles, and also the dynamics within Group 2. Thank you for listening to Group 2's Everest 1996 case analysis.